first here today, Jamie. Congratulations, Jamie. 1,000 Pine points for you. Someone asked a question here before we get started. Brian Dill, you going to share that spreadsheet from your last video? Yes, I did already. If Brian Dill, if you were paying attention, you would know it's on my Facebook page, PineCreek Doug, Facebook PineCreek Doug. And there's a link for both the spreadsheet and for my my Gospel of Mark, mimesis. So, all those pretty colors where I highlighted for the Gospel of Mark, showing that most of it, almost all of it, but most of it is non-historical. And I'm actually going to talk about that today. And the reason why I'm doing this video is because that YouTube top 5 Christian statistic thing I did, Inspiring Philosophy, even though he's a huge channel, and then the metrics I used basically normalize, mitigate the size of the channel, or not, mitigate's the wrong word. It basically looks at all the channels, no matter how big you are. I think except for you have to have more than 1,000 subs. Inspiring Philosophy I made, I think it was number 5. I think I made number 5 on the list. So I thought I need to do some more stuff on Inspiring Philosophy because he's such a swell guy, and he lives in the same city as me. And another reason why I'm doing this video is because I was watching, what's his name? Peter J. Williams talking to Bart Ehrman on Unbelievable, and they were talking about contradictions and the Judas contradiction. And then I saw another video with Bart Ehrman and Michael Licona and Craig Keener and another guy, I forget his name. And it was on, what's the guy's name? Jaros. And they were talking about contradictions as well. And the Judas contradiction came up again. So Judas Iscariot is popular nowadays. And so I got to give full credit to my friend in Eastern Europe, Camille Gregor, who gave me this idea of saying, Doug, why don't you use the inference to the best explanation? He didn't say it that way. He said, why don't you use what I'm showing now, what Michael Licona uses and what Inspiring Philosophy used to defend the hypothesis of the resurrection, that it explains the most. It has the most scope, power, plausibility, less ad hoc, and illuminates history and so forth. Those 5 criteria, why don't you use those 5 criteria against people who harmonize these contradictions away? I thought that was a brilliant idea. So that was last night, I think. And so today I worked on it. And as usual, I will be 80% right about everything I say and 20% wrong. So forgive me for the 20%. But I got things to do this week, and I wanted to get this on my YouTube channel. I think it'll be fun. And I'm going to congratulate IP as much as possible. And but I do think that this methodology, using these 5 criteria that historians use to defend the resurrection, you can use against them. You can take what they use to defend Christianity and turn it right back against them. And so, but I'm going to do it with gentleness and with love, because I'm just like Jeff Durbin. Oh my goodness. Okay, so those are the 5 criteria, and as I said, Michael Licona uses this criteria in his book, which I bought, The Resurrection of Jesus. Look how thick that is. Michael Licona came on my channel, and we talked about a lot of stuff, but I promised him that I would buy his book, and I did. And so I use this as most doors, they slam shut automatically when you go in and outside of your house. And I use this to keep the door open when I bring groceries in. So this works nicely. You just, like, this is, I think this is about 12 pounds. And it keeps the door open. And so Michael Licona uses those 5 criteria to defend the resurrection. As you see, the bottom says RH, that's the resurrection hypothesis, and then there's a whole bunch of other hypotheses above it. And it doesn't matter what those things stand for. They're just different hypotheses, but I think L stands for Ludemann hypothesis, or what Ludemann says about it. One of them is John Dominic Crossan. I think that's CS. What's CF? I wrote it down here. CF is Crayferts. Yeah, and the top one, what's the top one? Vermes. Yeah. So they all have different hypotheses to explain what the data that they see. And so Michael Licona, I think he has it right in the back, page 606. There it is, right there. And so he says that the resurrection hypothesis passes all 5 criteria: scope, power, plausibility, less ad hoc, and illumination. And but Inspiring Philosophy does a really good job at summarizing these 5 criteria, what they exactly mean. And so this is a slide from his video, which all the links are in the description box. I think most of the links. If not, I'll put them in later. And he's nicely explains in a really good, succinct way what these 5 criteria are, that the scope can explain all the facts, the power is that you can do it with the least amount of effort. That, to me, that's music to my ears. When you can explain something with the least amount of effort, I'm an efficiency guy. And so that's great. Less ad hoc, it adds least amount of assumptions in order to explain the data, plausibility, and illumination. I'm going to focus in on less ad hoc, and you're going to see right away that when it comes to harmonizing contradictions in the Bible, in the New Testament, in the Gospels, for example, how did Judas die? The less ad hoc one is the problem I think Christians have here, and how you can use how they defend the resurrection. You can turn around right back at them when they start harmonizing things up the yin-yang. Sorry, is that showing my age? Do kids nowadays say yin-yang? I don't think so. And then Inspiring Philosophy mentions a guy named Dr. Christopher Bean. I think that's how you pronounce his name. And I don't think he says this, but a lot of the 5 criteria, I think, I don't know if this Christopher Bean came up with the 5 criteria. I doubt it. But he's a Christian, PhD in philosophy of history, and he disagrees that the resurrection hypothesis passes all 5 criteria. So here's a Christian who doesn't even buy it. And the 2 that he thinks does not pass is the ad hoc and plausibility criterion. He says, and this is a quote from Dr. Bean, "The hypothesis that God exists and cared about Jesus is of questionable plausibility." Oh yeah, this is exactly what me and Camille Gregor were talking to Blake Giunta about. The hypothesis that God would want to raise Jesus from the dead and reveal him to the disciples and others is almost entirely ad hoc. Page 46 in his book, which I put in the description box. Okay, so let's let IP talk here about being.
Behen McCullough, who has outlined the criterion for weighing historical theories, accepts the resurrection hypothesis, meets these 3 things better than any other hypothesis, but claims it fails the other 2 pieces of criterion. This Christian hypothesis is of greater explanatory scope and power than other hypotheses, which try to account for the relevant evidence, but it is less plausible and more ad hoc than they are. So McCullough accepts the resurrection meets 3 out of 5 of the criteria for a historical investigation, but fails the other 2. However, there have been replies to challenge this. Dr. Travis Campbell asks, why is the resurrection theory ad hoc? To be ad hoc, according to McCullough, means a number of new suppositions are made by a hypothesis that are not already implied in existing knowledge. So the hypothesis adds extra assumptions in order to explain the data that is not already present.
Okay, so this is very important that I don't describe what ad hoc means, because if I do it just a little bit wrong, I'll get in trouble from Christians, theists in general. So I'm going to let, as I did, Inspiring Philosophy, I think he did a great job on explaining what ad hoc means. And just to drill it home even further, I got Licona's book here, and I'm going to, just hang on one second. I'm going to give an example of what ad hoc is using Michael Licona's book. Now, the text is there, but it's probably too small, but I'm going to read it. It's one page, but I think Dr. Michael Licona does a fantastic job of really hammering home what ad hocness is. Let us suppose that a robust 15-year-old male is not feeling well and consults his family physician. He describes his symptoms as follows: fever, vomiting, and pain in the lower right side of his abdomen. The physician has 3 medical students with him, and he asks what diagnosis they would offer. Sounds like House MD, right? The first student opines that the fever suggests that the boy has the flu, since that is the most common symptom of the ailment. The physician answers that the flu is not usually accompanied by vomiting and ab pain, so the flu diagnosis lacks explanatory scope, which was the second thing on the first criteria on the list. The second student offers that although vomiting and ab pain are rare symptoms in the case of the flu, it is still possible, though rare, that they resulted from having the flu. The physician agrees, but adds that if another diagnosis is more easily accommodates the symptoms, then the flu diagnosis would lack explanatory power. He continues that in all of his years of practicing medicine, he has never read a case of the flu in the professional literature that included the 3 symptoms the boy is exhibiting. Thus, the attempt of the second student to salvage the flu diagnosis also lacks plausibility. Okay, Christians, if you're listening, this is the part where you have to pay attention, because this is, in my mind, I'm thinking about inspiring philosophy as I'm about to read about the third medical student. The third student decides to use her imagination and suggest that the boy indeed has the flu, as indicated by the fever, and that since it is in the middle of the flu season, the plausibility factor is increased. There are reasons for the symptoms that are unrelated to the flu. Perhaps the boy is a martial artist and decided to work out in the prior evening despite his fever, and had been kicked in the lower right side of his abs during a sparring session. So that explains why he has ab pain. After practice, the boy went out with a few other students for a snack, which is reasonable, right? And now he was vomiting as a result of food poisoning. Well, that explains why he was vomiting. The physician replies that these conditions explain the 3 symptoms well, without any forcing or ambiguity. However, it does so at a price, since it requires 2 non-evidenced assumptions: that the boy is a martial artist who sustained an injury during practice and suffers from food poisoning from a meal he ate afterward. Therefore, the scenario posited by the third student is ad hoc. Thus saith Dr. Michael Licona. I feel like a pastor. So if you didn't know what ad hoc really means, there's a great example of what ad hoc means. So I made a little list here of all the things, the new suppositions by the third student, or ad hoc assumptions. We have that the patient practiced martial arts, but nowhere in the patient's records does it say that he practices martial arts. That the patient worked out even though he had a fever, that doesn't say that in the records. That the patient was kicked in the stomach, that doesn't say it in the records. And that the patient bought bad food and got food poisoning. Nowhere is that in the patient's records. But the third student just pulled this out of thin air and said, look, if this is true, then it explains why this boy has a fever and is vomiting and has pain in the side of his abs. Makes sense, right? But this is what I think guys like Inspiring Philosophy and other apologists, Christians who harmonize are doing. They are doing exactly what Dr. Michael Licona is saying. They are being ad hoc. Okay, so now let's apply this to how Judas died. So people who are not familiar with the Judas Iscariot story on how he died, what's the big deal, you're asking? Well, the big deal is Matthew 27 and verses 3 to 5 says that Judas died by hanging himself. And remember, Judas was paid money for betraying Jesus, and that he felt guilt or remorse or something like that, and he took the money that he got paid and he returned the money to the priests. The priests took that money and bought land. So that's what it says in Matthew 27. However, in Acts, it says that Judas didn't die from hanging. It does not say that. It says that he fell headlong, head first, in other words, and his guts spilled. And it also says in Acts that Judas used the money that he got. Doesn't say he returned it. It says he used it to buy some land. So now we're going to play.
This one can easily be addressed
Inspiring Philosophy on how Inspiring Philosophy addresses this issue.
by noting that Matthew is telling us how Judas died, and Luke is telling us the effects of Judas's body after his death. Matthew tells us Judas went out and hanged himself, but this happened on Friday when Jesus died. This one can easily be addressed by noting that Matthew is telling us how Judas died, and Luke is telling us the effects of Judas's.
Did I do it again? Here's the challenge. I apologize. The challenge is I want you to listen to Inspiring Philosophy, and I want you to find all the areas where he's being ad hoc, just like that third medical student. So you know how the third medical student just pulled things out of the air, like the boy was practicing martial arts and practiced while he was a fever. I want you, Inspiring Philosophy gave a great definition of what ad hoc means, and Dr. Michael Lacona gave a great example of what ad hoc is. Now I want you to listen closely to how Inspiring Philosophy addresses this problem of Judas, of how he died, and I want you to write down in the chat as soon as you hear Inspiring Philosophy being ad hoc.
Us how Judas died, and Luke is telling us the effects of Judas's body after his death. Matthew tells us Judas went out and hanged himself, but this happened on Friday when Jesus died, just before the Sabbath, when no one would have bothered to cut him down. The Jews also had to have.
Is my sound still not working? Hang on. Hawk.
Us how Judas died.
No, it's working now. Thank you.
Taboos about touching dead bodies. So it is likely no one would have wanted to go near a hanging body, especially the body of a traitor. If his body was left alone for days to decompose, when someone finally cut the rope or the branch snapped, the force of hitting the ground could have caused the body to burst open. The next issue is Matthew says the priest purchased the field, but Luke says Judas acquired it. So some skeptics suggest there is a contradiction in who purchased the field, but this isn't actually true. Matthew and Luke use two different Greek words here. Matthew uses a word that refers to making a business transaction, whereas Luke uses a word to refer to acquiring something, which can refer to purchasing but doesn't have to. So in other words, Matthew notes the priest bought the field, but Luke tells us that it belonged to Judas. So the priest would have bought it in Judas's name. This can be seen in Matthew, where the priest refused to put the money back into the treasury because it came from betraying innocent blood. Ancient societies, especially Jewish societies, had ritual purity laws against accepting money that was used for immoral purposes. So it makes sense that when the priest purchased the field, they would do it in Judas's name. Hence Judas acquired the field of blood. This avoids a paper transaction showing the priest bought something with blood money, avoiding a ritual purity issue for the public to see. Luke, of course, would report what a later writer would have seen from the records, whereas Matthew writes as one who was an eyewitness, having first-hand knowledge of how the purchasing of the field went down. So in reality, the accounts cohere nicely. Thus, this supposed contradiction can be resolved.
So that was, I apologize for being muted. I mute myself because I don't want any feedback, but I got to just stop doing that because if I forget, then it's big trouble. So, but I think I was only muted for maybe a minute at the most. But anyhow, I was watching the chat when I was playing that, and I saw people's answers to what they heard Inspiring Philosophy doing, being ad hoc. Now, this is what I came up with. The number of new suppositions by Inspiring Philosophy, ad hoc assumptions. The text, Inspiring Philosophy says Judas was already dead when his gusts burst. It actually doesn't say that in the text. Judas fell when taken down, or a rope tore, and I think he even mentioned a branch broke or something like that. Doesn't say that in the text. Judas fell headlong even though that he was hanged. Hanged? No, I think it's hung. I think I should have typed hung there. But it doesn't say that in the text. It says that in two separate accounts, but not together. Judas was dead for days before his guts burst. But it doesn't actually say that he was dead for days in the text. Ad hoc. Many people knew he was a traitor, IP said, that they would have left that body alone. Doesn't actually say that many people knew that Judas was a traitor. IP says that acquired doesn't mean purchased. Well, that could be true, but it actually doesn't say. It just says, most translations say that Judas purchased land in the version in Acts. It says priests bought the land in Judas's name. Nowhere does it say that the priest bought the land in Judas's name. He's making this up ad hoc, just like the third student said that the boy was a martial artist and got kicked in the stomach. Another one was Inspiring Philosophy said that Matthew was an eyewitness to the purchase of the land. Nowhere does it say in Matthew's account that he saw that the priests actually bought the land or how the land was purchased. It's almost like, for Christians listening, did Matthew, the author of the Gospel of Matthew, witness the birth of Jesus? Did he? Did he witness the birth of Jesus? Of course not. Yet he writes about it, right? There's an assumption here by Inspiring Philosophy, a supposition, an ad hoc supposition, that Matthew was actually an eyewitness of who bought the land. Okay. So now what I did here is I juxtaposed, I put them side by side, Michael Lacona's assumptions of that student that were ad hoc with Inspiring Philosophy's assumptions, ad hoc assumptions of the reconciliation of the two accounts of Judas's death. Notice that there's a lot more ad hocness by Inspiring Philosophy than even Michael Lacona's example of the third student. There's at least 3 or 4 more. But here's a side-by-side example of how to be ad hoc, and which fails this criteria test that I brought up at the very beginning of this live stream. So remember, this is what guys like Michael Lacona and Inspiring Philosophy use, these 5 criteria, to defend the resurrection of Jesus. Hey, the hypothesis that Jesus Christ rose from the dead passes all 5 of criteria, so you would be irrational to say that it didn't happen this way. Well, let's apply this same line of thinking to the death of Judas Iscariot. Now, my hypothesis is that one or both accounts got it wrong, that either the Acts account's wrong, or that the Matthew account is wrong, or that both are wrong. And I'm just focusing on the ad hoc right now, and I'm saying that, hey, if this is just a story, then it passes the less ad hoc test, because as we just saw what Inspiring Philosophy had to do, he had to throw in a lot of ad hocness in order to make it fit between the Acts account and the Matthew account. He had to throw things in like that they probably wouldn't have taken Judas's body down while it was hanging because he was a traitor and it was near the Sabbath. We don't even know exactly what time Judas did the betrayal. It was probably like maybe even in the middle of the night or very early morning. And he could have had like 12 hours to be taken down off that tree or wherever he was hung, if he was hung. Now, I say here that Inspiring Philosophy also failed the plausibility test. Now, why do I say that? Well, I'm going to let, what's his name? Peter J. Williams, and I think Inspiring Philosophy agrees with Peter J. Williams, who was on with Bart Ehrman on Unbelievable recently. I'm going to let him and Bart Ehrman illustrate for you why the harmonization is implausible.
If somebody's hanging and the rope snaps, that's happened before. How do they fall?
Down.
Do they fall head first?
Well, it depends what their feet
Does it
hit.
depend?
Yes, it does. It depends what they're hanging over.
Whenever you hear the word "it depends," that's a red flag that something ad hoc might be coming.
What do you mean?
Well, I mean, if you're hanging over something and there's a rock forward and you're going to trip on it and you go head forward, I mean, like, these things can happen. I don't know.
It sounds like we're doing CSI here, you know,
I mean, like,
crime scene
I
investigation.
just think the data's underdetermined.
Let me just say this. Yeah, it's underdetermined. So to reconcile it, you have to come up with a completely implausible scenario to reconcile it.
Yeah, to reconcile it, you have to come up with an implausible scenario. What's the implausible scenario that Peter J. Williams came up with? Well, Judas was hanging there, and somehow he fell and hit a rock and went forwards, and so he went headlong, head down, even though he was hanging from his neck, and then his guts spilled open. Like, this is very similar to that boy got kicked in the stomach, and that's why he has ab pain and the flu at the same time. What's interesting is that I actually think if you watch Inspiring Philosophy's video on reconciling, it's only 5 or 6 minutes long. Again, the link is in the description. If you watch it, I think Inspiring Philosophy actually agrees with me that one or both accounts got it wrong. Well, he probably wouldn't say both, but I think he would say that one account got it wrong. He admits, Inspiring Philosophy admits that there could be scribal errors, and that Matthew's account could be non-literal, in other words, non-historical. So if Inspiring Philosophy thinks that you can reconcile these two accounts in a way to capture all the details of both stories, the Matthew and the Acts story, and yet there's still scribal errors and there's still non-literal, non-historical explanations, it makes his explanation even more ad hoc to throw that in. So this is Inspiring Philosophy talking about how Matthew, I think this is Inspiring Philosophy actually agreeing with me here that one or both accounts are wrong.
John Polhill also notes there is some early evidence the original reading may have become swollen instead of falling headlong. The phrases are similar in Greek, and it could have been a scribal error. Another theory that has been proposed is that Matthew is not being literal, but is describing Judas's death in terms of the traitor Ahithophel from 2 Samuel 17. Audrey Conrad notes that Matthew's use of the words "for departed" and "hanged himself" occur in 2 Samuel 17:23. Plus, John's Gospel also compares Judas to Ahithophel. So Matthew is essentially telling us that Judas went out and became another Ahithophel.
Now, this is fascinating to me. Inspiring Philosophy is saying that Judas went out and became another, this is a weird name, Ahithophel. Judas went out and became another Ahithophel. And where does this come from? This comes from the Old Testament. In other words, that Judas's character is imitating a character called Ahithophel in the Old Testament from 2 Samuel 17:23 to create a non-literal, a non-historical narrative. Now, here's the kicker. Inspiring Philosophy, why can't I say that about Jesus? Why can't I say that about certain stories depicted in the Gospels as Jesus being another Moses, or Jesus being another Elijah, or Jesus being another Elisha.
And hanging himself would just be terminology to denote he died the death worthy of a traitor. It would be sort of like today if I said someone bit the dust. It is a cultural expression to denote someone died, not that someone literally bit dust.
Yeah, not like someone literally bit dust. And not like Jesus literally rose from the dead, right? If he is like a new Moses, a new Elijah, a new Elisha. By the way, this is nothing new. There's people like John Dominic Crossan will say things like this, that it's not a literal bodily resurrection, it's a figurative, metaphorical one.
Matthew might be doing a similar thing with the phrase, went out and hanged himself. It's possible the culture of that day would have understood this as a way to say he died the death of a traitor, like Ahithophel.
Okay, so a while back, could even be a year now. No, I think it was earlier this year, well, which is approaching a year. I went through the Gospel of Mark, the first Gospel, which the other Gospels depend upon, rely upon, borrow from. And I went through and I highlighted all the Old Testament quotations, because that's not historical. It's just quoting the Old Testament. All the parables, that's not historical. And then all in purple, what you see here is exactly what Inspiring Philosophy is talking about with, how do you pronounce his name? Ahithophel. Matthew's portrayal of Judas is like Ahithophel in 2 Samuel 17:23. If Inspiring Philosophy can make that connection, why can't I make that connection with Jesus with the Old Testament? And everything in purple that you see here is what I did. This is going to cause a huge problem for Christians listening, because if they agree with Inspiring Philosophy with this whole idea of Judas is another Ahithophel, a character of the Old Testament, a narrative was built using the Old Testament, why can't I do that with Jesus? And by the way, Inspiring Philosophy is in good company with this idea of borrowing from the Old Testament. This is from Cam Spires. He recently just made a list of the professionals, the historians, the PhDs, who agree with Inspiring Philosophy on his main idea that a narrative can be created using the Old Testament, but these guys do it for Jesus. These are probably historians, professionals that conservative, fundamentalist type apologists don't like, because they're basically saying, this stuff about, John the Baptist meeting Jesus at the Jordan to start his ministry, that's very similar to Elisha and Elijah meeting at the Jordan and so forth. Maybe this stuff didn't happen in history. Maybe it's non-literal, just like Judas and Ahithophel. I hate that name. Okay. Let's move on. So now if we can do this for Judas's death, think about every case, every specific case you've heard. Apologists, pastors, Christians try to harmonize in the New Testament. And it's not just the Gospels, it's even with some of Paul's letters. Think about all those instances. Now, this is just a short list of where apologists have to harmonize, how they have to throw on ad hocness in order to make things work. When was Jesus born? Where was Jesus born? In a barn or a house? Where did Jesus go after being born? What are the genealogies of Jesus? What did Jesus teach his disciples? Because in one gospel it says fast, and the other gospel it says not to fast. Did the temple cleansing happen before or during Passover? Who went to the tomb? Who saw Jesus, and in what order? When did Jesus ascend into heaven? I think Acts says after 40 days, but the other gospels seem to imply within one day of his resurrection. So here's the kicker. If you agree with me that it's ad hoc to have this harmonization with Judas, and it's not the best explanation according to those 5 criteria, then in every case you have this problem when you try to harmonize. And then what ends up happening? What ends up happening is you really don't know what Jesus said, what Jesus did. In fact, the whole reliability of the Gospels, of the New Testament in general, come into question.
The resurrection is the only theory that can explain all the data, and it can do it while not being ad hoc or implausible.
Okay. And I would say that the hypothesis that one or more accounts got things wrong is the only theory that explains all the data and can do it while not being ad hoc or implausible. Now here's Michael Licona.
Universal consensus of scholarship agree upon. Now, let's try to find the best explanation for these things. And when we do this using the criteria typically employed by professional historians, the resurrection hypothesis wins, and it wins big.
It wins big. So to Inspiring Philosophy, when looking at your explanation of Judas's death, let's try to find the best explanation for these things. And when we do this, using that criteria, those 5 criteria, typically employed by professional historians, the got it wrong hypothesis, in other words, the Gospels got it wrong, one or more of them, it wins. That hypothesis wins, and it wins big. So this is a way to use the Christians' defense of the resurrection of Jesus right back against them by saying that all these harmonizations that they use fails it's more ad hoc, it's less plausible, as we saw Peter Williams say. Just had to come up with something to consolidate harmonize the headlong and being hung. It becomes implausible and more ad hoc. So again, kudos to Camille Gregor, who's probably sleeping right now in Eastern Europe, for coming up with this idea. And I think it actually works really, really well. And I encourage non-Christians, if you're listening to this, to use this strategy right back at them whenever you hear a Christian harmonize what they would call apparent contradictions or frictions or just tough things to reconcile. Bring up these 5 criteria and focus on the less ad hoc criteria and the plausibility criterion, and show how it fails. Use Dr. Michael Licona as a Christian guide to use to say, look, this is what being ad hoc is, and this is what you're doing. You're just throwing in possible explanations, not plausible, possible explanations to make things fit. What do you think? Again, I apologize for being muted I can delete that after this live stream is done, but then I'll lose the comments, so I'll probably just leave that muteness in there. So if you have any questions or comments, tag me. You got 2 minutes. Yes, Jesus' last words on the cross is golden. A good one. They have to come up with ad hoc explanations for that. That Jesus said all of them, or that his attitude changed. But nowhere in the text does it say that. The ad hocness of when Jesus was born is another. Oh, there was more than one census. Wouldn't God have to violate the free will of all those intermediaries in order to compile the Gospels inerrantly? Yes, good point, Ben Roberts. Humans are not perfect, so if you want a perfect word, you got to make humans perfect. Brother John, don't bring that up. Thanks, Heath. Yeah, nativity story, boy, that whole where did Jesus go after he was born? Was it Egypt? Was it and stayed in near Jerusalem and then went back to Nazareth, Galilee? Or it's like, if you look at certain apologetic websites, they actually have models of how to fit everything in. It's all ad hoc. Is it possible to get a copy of your document shown earlier? Yes, Nick J. It is on my Facebook page, PineCreek Doug on Facebook. It has this if you want this right here, if you want to see that, it's in PDF form on my PineCreek page. Thank you for the donation, DB Cisco. It's all Tinkerbell Jesus. Just believe and it's true. Jesus' last words were, just ask Mike Winger. Well done. Yeah, Trinity. Yes, Jordan. It's contradiction of the thieves on the cross on if one or both of them ridicule Jesus. Now, typically, I advise non-Christians not to focus on contradictions that much because of this issue of harmonization. Because just whatever you say, oh, I know a guy, I know my apologist friend, he told me this can be harmonized. Show them this video. Do any Christians interpret Jesus' resurrection as not literal? Yes, Ryrez. His name is John Dominic Crossan. Another one is, he calls himself a Christian. Another Christian is Dennis R. McDonald. He calls himself a Christian, and he thinks most of the Gospels is myth. So if you came late, Inspiring Philosophy uses these 5 criteria to explain the death of Judas. No, he doesn't. He uses ad hocness to explain. And I'm saying you can use these 5 criteria to show that he is using ad hocness. Let him know he's being ad hoc. And that according to these 5 criteria, that the hypothesis of one or both accounts being wrong is more likely. Let me see if I can find it. This one. The hypothesis of one or both accounts in Acts of Matthew got it wrong is a better explanation of what actually happened than Inspiring Philosophy's hypothesis. But like I said, Inspiring Philosophy even admitted that there could be scribal errors, or that mimesis, imitation, was going on. So I think he might even agree with me. My apologies to Inspiring Philosophy. He was scheduled to come on and defend himself, but we ran out of time. Have a great evening, what's left of your weekend. Thanks for hanging out with me, guys. Take care.